Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on the Enlightenment, The Pursuit of Happiness by Ritchie Robertson, because I absolutely love this book. It was certainly part of my pursuit of happiness this summer. It is an incredibly well-written book. Ritchie Robertson goes into wonderful detail. He fills his pages with personalities, with numerous quotations from primary sources. It's very thoroughly researched. There's some 200 pages of citations at the end of this book for a reader who wants to go and pursue those texts and get an even more immersive study in the thinking of the Enlightenment. But it is just wonderfully well written. Robertson is able to take quotes from different writers, different thinkers, different personalities, or two quotes from the same writer's life and fuse those together and in such a lucid manner explain the different changes that are occurring, what is being reinforced, what is being refined in terms of thought during the Enlightenment. He also creates an exhaustive study. This book examines so many different themes, so many different topics across the Enlightenment, but it's all from the perspective of the pursuit of happiness. It's a tension between an individual's happiness and the idea of what's emerging as a public happiness or a state's happiness, a community's happiness that exists within the Enlightenment. It's something that Robertson finds somewhat unique, a true development in human culture, certainly European culture, which is where the book is primarily centered, though North America, the Caribbean, even parts of Western Asia come into play in great detail. Along with Western Africa and the depredations that would occur there during this period as well. But Robertson's focus is very much on Europe and on the development of thought. And within that, he's truly exhaustive in going in and examining so many different areas of life in which the Enlightenment was developing, was examining new theories, truly trying to refine life so that more individuals could be happy. And I want to give just a quotation from the very beginning of the book where Robertson goes and cites a number of different writers. He goes, and this is how he opens: "The Enlightenment declared the conviction that the goal of life was happiness, and that if this goal could be attained at all, it was to be found in the here and now, despite the manifold imperfections of earthly life. As early as 1671, the philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz defined wisdom as the science of happiness. John Locke wrote in 1677, 'The business of man is to be happy in this world by enjoyment of the things of nature subservient to life, health, ease, and pleasure, and by the comfortable hopes of another life.' Locke publicly reaffirmed the priority of happiness in his essay concerning human understanding in 1690, one of the Enlightenment's foundational texts. 'I lay it for certain ground that every intelligent being really seeks happiness, which consists in the enjoyment of pleasure, without any considerable mixture of uneasiness.' Alexander Pope, in the Essay on Man, 1733-34, famously apostrophized, 'Happiness, our being's end and aim.' The pursuit of happiness was equally famous among the basic human rights formulated by Thomas Jefferson in the preamble to the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. But this pursuit was not confined to Western Europe and North America. Far away in what is now Romania, Iosipus Mosaides, head of the princely academy at Iași, now Iași, defied the Orthodox Church by issuing a similar message in his apology in 1780. 'Sound philosophy is a comprehensive theory which investigates the nature of things always, with an eye to their end, so that it promotes the true happiness that mankind as mankind can enjoy upon the earth.' And those are sort of the foundation of where Robertson is going to take this book. He really believes that the Enlightenment was, if there was a single value underpinning the many different themes and topics that would be explored in the Enlightenment, the many different languages and national identities, cultures that would be involved in the Enlightenment, it was that these were all thinkers who were becoming more and more concerned with, okay, can an individual be happy here and now? Is there a way to find pleasure here and now in this life, rather than this deferred pleasure for an afterlife, which Robertson doesn't go into great detail around this, but an idea that had sort of been a more dominant idea before the Enlightenment, that life could be truly miserable here, but that was okay. Your happiness was deferred until an afterlife, particularly in the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. But Robertson notes the Enlightenment was about seeing that happen now in this life, and that if an individual couldn't always have everything he or she or they wanted, perhaps rather a larger public sphere, a community could be happy. There could be greater happiness for greater people And how would that be explored? And so that is really where he underpins this. It's very interesting. He's very clear around that his central tenet is not that this was an age of reason, that this was dominated by rationalism. He explores the thinkers who were dominated by that primary focus, who were rationalists or were empiricists or wanted to pursue reason. But he notes that there were so many who were rather using reason as a means to pursue happiness, their own and that of their communities. And so it is, as I said, incredibly well researched. It's incredibly well developed. He examines ideas around a religious enlightenment. What was the toleration that was beginning to be allowed in the some 100 years after the 30 Years War in Europe? Very much a war of religion. In the aftermath of the French Wars of religion, how was religious toleration beginning to occur in Europe, and how was it not occurring? What were the different models that were being adopted, including in the Holy Roman Empire? He also begins to explore the scientific revolution, the idea that thinkers as remote as Bacon to the Enlightenment, but as well Rene Descartes, how had they contributed to the Enlightenment? He goes into detail around Isaac Newton, whose Principia Mathematics is even quoted in the book, and the ways that Newton's sort of thinking truly was a scientific revolution and had built on thinkers like Galileo. And so Robertson is not confining himself to a political sphere or to examining the schools of the French philosophes. He is not simply confining himself to Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment with David Hume and the development of their version of empiricism and humanism, and then political economy under Smith. He explores all of those avenues. He explores how the Enlightenment affected people of faith and also people who were beginning to veer towards more explicit deism or even atheism. And he's clear, Robertson is clear in developing that there were so many different strands expanding in this time that it's very hard to often pigeonhole thinkers. A writer might produce a text, and he notes when it might have been due to censorship and when it might have just been that the writer's ideas were changing, the individual's ideas were changing around that own individual's development from atheism towards deism or vice versa. And so Robertson is just exhaustively well researched in this text. He examines so many ideas. One of the more interesting approaches he has in the Enlightenment is that he goes in and explores how were some of these ideas worked out in fictional works. So he spends a good deal of time quoting from different novels of the 18th century, different plays, poems of the 18th century. So writers like certainly Jonathan Swift come in, not just for his A Modest Proposal, but also for Gulliver's Travels and A Tale of the Tub. A writer like Schiller comes in, and with Wallenstein specifically. Numerous poets, including Alexander Pope, brought up. Samuel Johnson with the Vanity of Wishes, but even other writings he had done, they are explored in detail. Schroederus de Laclos with Les Liaisons Dangereuses is examined. And part of this is an examination around morality. How did morality change across the Enlightenment? Was it rather that people continued to do what they had done, they just didn't bother to hide it? Or were there shifts in individual and private morality or in public morality? And how did those shifts transcend class bounds or gender bounds? Tristram Shandy is certainly present, which delighted me. Goethe, often thought of, along with Schiller, as a thinker of the Romantic era. What Robertson does so well is to examine that when we stop thinking of the Enlightenment as this hidebound age of reason, we actually begin to see how many writers in the 18th century sort of build another phase of the Enlightenment, and the ways in which the Romantic era was a reaction to the Enlightenment and even to the sense of this naturalism that was occurring within the Enlightenment. Samuel Richardson's Clarissa is quoted, and their plot is sadly spoiled by Robertson, which is strange when you have a 781-page book that spoils the plot of a 1,200-page novel. But the scope of Robertson's writing is really fantastic, and it's something that I enjoyed. It's something that makes me want to recommend this book so highly. He is examining all of those ideas. He's quoting from Adam Smith, not just the The Wealth of Nations, but also the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and saying, look, like, Smith is held up now as this text of laissez-faire classical liberalism in economics, but he is railing against monopolies throughout this text, and Robertson is willing to point towards how does this issue or this topic resonate with readers in the 20th century and the 21st century. The final 20 pages of the book examine a couple of ideas that weren't necessarily developed fully during the Enlightenment, but remain very deeply relevant issues now. Ideas around human rights, ideas around nationalism, and several other ideas that he goes in and examines. Okay, what is the nature of liberalism? Something that's currently under debate in many countries that the Enlightenment stemmed from. Writers, he does go and examine the different strands of national enlightenments, a Scottish Enlightenment, a French Enlightenment, a German Enlightenment, but he doesn't organize the book that way. He organizes it topically. He goes in and notes, okay, this is going to be a chapter on cosmopolitanism. And then there are going to be 5 or 6 different subheadings across this chapter that are examining different facets of cosmopolitanism. How did this develop? And so it's, rather than being arranged strictly chronologically, it is arranged by themes and topics. So a reader who may not want to read the entire book, as fantastic as it is, could get a copy from the library or a copy and just read the portion that really fascinates and interests you, because there's a sense in developing a great awareness around that one topic in 50 pages or so. The way that the theory of history was changing across the Enlightenment, that's really well explored. Certainly Gibbon, with the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, comes in. But there are other historians that he wants to note and explore and examine. And then Robertson concludes the book towards the end by examining the revolutions that occur sort of at the end of this period. He notes that there were antecedent revolutions, that there were revolts among the Dutch, and not the Dutch revolt against Habsburg Spain, but rather a Dutch revolt against the stateholder there in the United Provinces. But he also notes the way that the revolution in the US developed, the way that the revolution in France developed, and not so much going into great detail around those, but rather what seemed to be the Enlightenment roots that were being quoted. Was it John Locke, or was it, who was being quoted, who was being examined? And he notes a key difference was that within England, most of the Glorious Revolution, sort of at the very beginning of this phase, at the end of the 17th century, was very much an assertion of a restoration of ancient rights, versus the US and France, the revolutions that occurred there, were much more dominated by a sense of taking rights that perhaps had not been granted, or that were beyond what had been, were ancient rights granted by a government, but were natural rights as humans. And so that's an interesting way to develop it. He does mention at the very, very, very end that how the French Revolution stemmed ultimately to the Haitian Revolution, but he doesn't develop that in great detail. I would recommend if one wants to read this, and all of the great thinkers are quoted in here: Diderot, Voltaire, Rousseau is developed in great detail. As I had mentioned, Schilling, Lessing, Goethe, Hume, Pope, Joseph Addison, numerous thinkers are quoted. But there are works that sort of build and amplify the gaps that still continue to exist even in this exhaustive study. So The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James would be a great place. A more fictional work, but something I was sort of reading in tandem with this, would be Memory of Fire, Faces and Masks by Eduardo Galeano, to examine, as much as this Enlightenment was occurring, what was it leading to in South and Central America and the Caribbean and in North America? How were the First Nations and West Africans being affected there? Another work that sort of amplifies some of these personalities even more would be When the World Spoke French, edited by Marc Fumaroli. And this explores people who were not necessarily French, but were writing in French because that was the sort of language of commerce that existed during that century. And so there are numerous English, German, Prussian, Russian, right, individuals who wrote in French, and Fumaroli sort of collects and collates that into this wonderful book. Paul Hazard's Crisis of the European Mind sort of picks up the early part of this. I don't know that his sequel to this book has ever been published by NYRB Books. I'll have to look at that. And then there are ways in which Bentham is brought up towards the end, but Kant is someone who is sort of viewed as a key peak within the Enlightenment, someone who developed a couple of different strands and perhaps didn't manage to tie off his questions with a bow, or his, really put a period on the thoughts he was pursuing, but he seemed to take some of the thoughts about as far as they went during the phase of the Enlightenment. So those would be writers to examine. It was fun to find a writer who wanted to quote from the Spectator so often. Addison's Spectator can be quite difficult to find, or Addison was primarily quoted, but Addison and Steele's Spectator can be quite hard to find. But there's a way in which the style that Robertson employs throughout the book is very much informed by the style of Addison, a style that is not florid and ornate, but is very plain and clear, and the idea that one should be precise and clear in what one says is quite nice. Another, as I had mentioned, Voltaire certainly comes in. He's quoted at length. His philosophical writings, even his plays are quoted at times, his letters. The strange relationship between Voltaire and Frederick the Great, and the questions around, what types of government existed are examined, and the idea of could there be an enlightened despot or an enlightened absolutism, what could that look like? And then Mary Wollstonecraft is certainly quoted with her Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and the idea that as much as education had changed, as much as ideas around punishment and torture had changed, there was still a great deal of tradition that continued to exist, and how there were women who were able to attain a level of higher education and pursue university education. But Wollstonecraft is quoted to show another strand in the Enlightenment that didn't really get fully developed, and Robertson notes would not be developed for many, many more years, along with the abolition of slavery. So there are so many wonderful writers and thinkers that he draws from, and there's so much I learned from this book. I just enjoyed it so much. Any sample paragraph will have, 1 to 3 citations easily, and so it's something I enjoyed. I highly recommend this. I was sort of reading it for the third quarter of Historathon, but also because someone I had really respected read it when it first came out and just absolutely loved it. So I was excited to get my hands on a copy and spend some time with it. So I hope you will as well. Thank you.